I didn't understand losing. He knew something about that, so he prepared himself. He reserved his power and his strength. I had nothing in the back of my mind to shield me up.
At 76, George Foreman finally admits what he never dared to say out loud. The man who once walked into the ring like a storm in human form, a fighter who broke bones with a single punch and frightened an entire era of heavyweights, now reveals something that shocks even his closest followers. For the first time, he speaks openly about the fighters he truly feared. Not the men he respected, not the men he admired, the men whose names made him pause inside his own mind. It sounds impossible. How could a giant like Foreman fear anyone? How could the same man who crushed Joe Frazier in 2 rounds and folded Ken Norton like steel under pressure ever feel a moment of doubt? But behind the myth of invincibility, behind the massive shoulders and the cold stare, there were nights when Foreman sat alone, replaying certain names in his thoughts. 5 names, 5 styles, 5 shadows he could never fully escape. And today, at 76, he stops hiding. The truth is simple but startling. Power did not protect him from fear. Fame did not erase vulnerability. And no matter how terrifying Foreman appeared to the world, inside his heart he carried memories of fighters whose presence changed the air in the room. Men whose reputation struck deeper than any punch. Some of them he faced, some of them he avoided, some of them were one punch away from ending the legend before it began. And one of them, he says quietly, made him question everything he believed about himself. These are not random names. These are not casual opinions. These are the 5 men who shaped the fear behind the force. The 5 fighters George Foreman never wanted to confront in the darkness of his own thoughts. So the real question is, who made the strongest man of the 70s feel small for a moment? Who carried the kind of danger that not even Foreman wanted to test? And which name will shock you the most? Because in the story of every legend, there are battles the public never sees. Tonight, we finally uncover the 5 fighters George Foreman feared the most. George Foreman's story did not begin as the tale of a champion. It began in the raw streets of Houston during the 1950s, where survival came long before discipline. As a boy, he fought not for pride, but for safety. By his teenage years, anger was the only language he understood. Everything changed when he entered the Job Corps, where a simple introduction to boxing became the doorway to a different life. Within months, coaches realized they were watching a natural force, a young man whose power came not from technique, but from a storm that lived inside him. In 1968, Foreman shocked the world by winning Olympic gold in Mexico City. He did not finesse his opponents. He overwhelmed them. And when he stepped into the professional ranks, he carried that same energy. Through the early 70s, few men lasted long enough to understand what hit them. Joe Frazier fell 6 times before the fight was stopped. Ken Norton, one of the toughest men of the era, could not withstand the pressure. Foreman became the undefeated heavyweight champion at a time when the division was filled with giants. But greatness has a different meaning in the heavyweight world. Power builds legends, yet styles create nightmares. And even at his peak, Foreman knew his strength alone could not conquer every kind of fighter standing across the ring. Certain men carried the wrong angles, the wrong rhythm, the wrong type of danger. These were the fighters who made Foreman look deeper than force, fighters whose names he kept off interviews and out of the spotlight. His career shaped him into a symbol of raw dominance. But his fears, the ones he never admitted until now, revealed the truth behind the legend. Number 5, Larry Holmes. If the young George Foreman feared the aura of Sonny Liston, and the prime George Foreman feared the power of Shavers and the wrath of Lyle, then the older and wiser George Foreman feared something far more technical. The possibility of being dismantled piece by piece by a man who fought like a surgeon. That man was Larry Holmes. Holmes never needed to roar, posture, or intimidate. His jab did the talking for him. For many, it was the cleanest jab in heavyweight history, snapping heads back like a whip and breaking down even the toughest fighters over the course of 12 long rounds. Foreman respected every kind of fighter, but Holmes embodied the type of style he always admitted gave him the most trouble. A tall boxer with reach, footwork, discipline, and a jab sharp enough to pierce through any defense. Holmes and Foreman were from the same era, yet in a way, they lived in parallel worlds. While Foreman crushed his opponents early, Holmes wore them down slowly, gradually, with a cold precision that frustrated even the most confident challengers. He turned brawlers into hesitant men. He turned punchers into confused thinkers. and Foreman knew exactly what that meant. He knew Holmes possessed the one weapon that neutralized power better than anything else: timing. Foreman's style relied on pressure. He walked forward, cutting off the ring, forcing exchanges that favored his raw strength. But Holmes was the fighter who simply did not let you get close. He could jab and move for 15 rounds. He could force an aggressive heavyweight to reset again and again until frustration turned into mistakes. Mistakes turned into openings, and openings turned into disaster. Foreman understood this perfectly. During his comeback in the early 1990s, reporters constantly asked him whether he would consider fighting Holmes. Foreman always smiled politely, gave the usual answers about promoters and timing, but years later he admitted the truth. He said Holmes had a kind of sharpness that could make a strong man look slow and a confident man look unsure. It was not fear of being hurt. It was fear of being undone mentally, of being controlled by a fighter whose rhythm was impossible to break. There is a moment in an interview Foreman gave in the late 2010s where he spoke openly about his regrets. He said, "Holmes was the style I never wanted. You cannot beat a man like that by walking forward. He will take you apart with the basics. Coming from a two-time heavyweight champion, this was not an insult. It was respect in its purest form. Holmes was a master of fundamentals, and fundamentals are the one thing raw power cannot always overcome." While Foreman had the punch to knock out any man alive, Holmes had the discipline to prevent that punch from ever landing cleanly. A fight between them would not have been a war like Foreman versus Lyle. It would have been a slow drowning, the kind of fight where the stronger man is forced to confront his own limitations one jab at a time. Foreman never hid that truth, and that honesty is what makes this revelation so rare. Number 4. Sonny Liston. Long before George Foreman became a world champion, long before his name carried fear across the heavyweight division, there was one man who defined what intimidation meant to him. That man was Sonny Liston. And unlike Ali, Shavers, or Lyle, the fear Foreman felt toward Liston came long before he ever became famous. It was the fear of a young fighter meeting the embodiment of everything he thought a heavyweight should be, yet hoped he would never have to face. Foreman always spoke of Liston with a complicated mix of admiration and unease. He called him a mentor. He called him an idol. But behind those respectful words was a quieter truth. He also admitted that Liston was the only man he never wanted to spar with, not because of technique, not because of reputation, but because Liston carried something that Foreman could not understand at the time: a darkness, a weight in the air. A presence so overwhelming that even the strongest young fighters felt small in his shadow. In the early 1970s, when Foreman was still developing, he occasionally trained around the same gyms where Liston prepared. Foreman remembered how the room would change when Liston walked in. Conversations stopped. Fighters avoided eye contact. Even trainers spoke softer. Foreman later said, "He did not intimidate you with words. It was in his eyes, in the way he stood. Like he already knew how the fight would end." Liston was past his prime by the time Foreman rose to prominence, but even an aging Liston was enough to send chills through the gym. His hands looked like sledgehammers. His shoulders were massive. His stare was cold and focused. Foreman, known for his confidence even as a young man, never stepped forward to challenge him. He stayed respectful, careful, aware of how dangerous Liston still was. What Foreman feared most was not a beating. It was the feeling that Liston understood violence on a level deeper than anyone else. Fighters like Ali used intelligence, Shavers used power, Lyle used will, but Liston used inevitability. He had the aura of a man who had already walked through hell long before he ever put on a pair of gloves. Foreman once said, "Some fighters are dangerous, but Sonny Liston was something else. You felt him before he touched you." And Foreman was not alone. Many heavyweights from that era admitted they feared Liston's reputation more than his punches. Stories followed him everywhere. Stories about his past, about the hard life he lived before boxing saved him, and about the cold silence he carried like armor. These stories were not hype. They were warnings. As Foreman became champion, people asked him whether he would have fought Liston in the same era. He always paused. He always sighed. And he always answered carefully. Sonny was the kind of man you did not want to meet on the wrong night. I respected him too much. It is rare for a champion to admit fear of someone he never even fought. But this fear came from a deeper, more human place. Sonny Liston was the image of everything Foreman knew he could become if anger and power were left unchecked. Facing Liston meant facing the darker version of himself. Number 3, Ron Lyle. If Muhammad Ali challenged Foreman's mind, and Earnie Shavers challenged his sense of danger, then Ron Lyle challenged something even deeper. He made Foreman feel mortal. The fight between George Foreman and Ron Lyle in 1976 is still remembered as one of the most violent heavyweight battles ever recorded. But for Foreman, it was more than a slugfest. It was the night he came closest to losing everything. Ron Lyle did not walk into the ring to box. He walked in to break a man. His life before boxing had been shaped by prison time, survival, and a quiet rage that seemed to follow him everywhere. And when he fought, that history came with him. Foreman later said that Lyle had a different kind of energy, something cold, something that made the ring feel smaller when he stepped inside. From the first bell, the fight was chaos. Foreman expected to control the ring as he always had. What he did not expect was a man who refused to step backward. Lyle met him in the center and threw punches that came like artillery fire, heavy, fast, aimed to destroy. Foreman exchanged with him, expecting Lyle to fade. But with each exchange, Lyle grew bolder. And then came the moment Foreman never forgot. Lyle caught him clean, a short, sharp right hand. Foreman hit the canvas. For the first time in his career, Foreman felt the world tilt. Not like Ali's knockout, which came from exhaustion and deception. Lyle's knockdown felt like a man trying to rip the crown off his head with bare hands. Foreman got up, still dazed, still trying to decode the chaos. But Lyle did not give him time. Seconds later, Lyle dropped him again. The arena shook with disbelief. The destroyer was being destroyed. Foreman survived only by instinct. No plan, no clarity, just survival. In the corner between rounds, he looked like a man fighting ghosts. Sweat poured down his face. His eyes were unfocused. And yet, in that haze, something old and primal woke up inside him. In the next round, he unleashed a furious assault that finally broke Lyle's guard and sent him crashing to the canvas for good. Foreman won the fight, but victory and fear are not opposites. Sometimes they live in the same place. Years later, when Foreman reflected on his career, he did not talk about the belts or the knockouts when speaking of Lyle. He talked about that moment on the canvas, that breath where he felt everything slipping away. He said, "Ron Lyle made me feel something I had never felt. I felt vulnerable." Lyle did something no other fighter achieved. He forced Foreman to confront his own limits, not through strategy or speed, but through raw, unfiltered violence. It was a fight that aged him, changed him, and shook him in a way no other opponent ever had. If Foreman feared anyone's power, it was Shavers. If he feared anyone's intelligence, it was Ali. But if he feared a man's presence, a man's will to destroy, it was Ron Lyle. Number 2, Earnie Shavers. Before George Foreman ever stepped into the ring with Muhammad Ali, before the world called him a monster of the heavyweight division, there was one man whose name alone made even the most fearless fighters shift uncomfortably in their seats. That man was Earnie Shavers. And decades later, Foreman finally admitted the truth. If Earnie Shavers hit me clean, I would not be standing. I knew that. In the frequency, coming from a man whose punches were often described as like being hit by a truck, this admission reveals everything. Earnie Shavers did not need a long list of world titles. He did not need the spotlight. What he carried was far more terrifying. Pure, unfiltered power. Fighters from the 1970s still talk about it with a nervous laugh, as if remembering an accident they narrowly survived. Larry Holmes once said that Shavers hit so hard it felt like electricity going through my body. Ron Lyle described it as a thud that made the soul shake. Foreman felt the same threat, even though they never fought. He watched Shavers knock out men who were known for granite chins. He watched him send shockwaves through the division every time his right hand landed. Yet what frightened Foreman most was not the highlight reels. It was the unpredictability. Shavers could be losing every round, looking exhausted, slow, ready to break. But one punch from him could erase everything. He turned fights around in a single heartbeat. Foreman, with all his size and strength, understood that better than anyone. When people asked why Foreman never agreed to fight Shavers during their prime, he always gave diplomatic answers. Different promoters, different timelines, different negotiations. But years later, when he was older, softer spoken, and more honest than ever, He finally said the words that revealed the truth. I did not need to fight Shavers. I did not need to prove anything to him. That man could end your night without warning. Foreman was never afraid of a man's personality. He never feared the stare down or the pressure of the crowd. What he feared was the one thing he could not control, the possibility that no matter how strong he was, someone out there might hit even harder. And that someone was Earnie Shavers. Foreman's style was built on pressure. He walked forward, cutting the ring, trading heavy shots to break his opponent's will. But Shavers was the wrong man to trade with. A single exchange could flip destiny upside down. Foreman knew that stepping inside Shavers' range was like stepping into a fire you could not put out. There is a quiet moment in one of Foreman's later interviews where he smiles to himself, almost embarrassed, and says, "He had the kind of punch that made you think about your children, your future, everything." It was half joke, half confession. The kind of line a fighter says only when the danger is real. Shavers represented the only thing more frightening than a skilled boxer, a puncher who needed nothing but one perfect second. And Foreman, the man who made so many others fear his power, carried a private truth he revealed only at the end of his life. When it came to pure punching force, there was one man he never wanted to test. That man was Earnie Shavers. Number 1, Muhammad Ali. There is a reason Muhammad Ali stands at the top of this list. For George Foreman, Ali was not just an opponent. He was the one man whose presence could shake the foundation of Foreman's confidence. And Foreman, even decades later, never hid the truth. He once said quietly in an interview, "I did not fear any man, but I feared the idea of facing Ali again." It was not a confession of weakness. It was an admission of reality. To understand why, you have to step back into the year 1974, days before the Rumble in the Jungle. Foreman was a destroyer. 24 wins, never defeated. Only 2 men had ever reached the 7th round against him. He hit with a violence that made even heavyweight veterans tense up. His reputation alone was enough to break fighters before the first bell. But Ali did not break. He walked through the storm like a man who had been waiting for it. In Zaire, the psychological war began long before the punches. Ali taunted him. He teased him. He smiled at him with a calmness that Foreman could not decode. Foreman later said that Ali's mind games did not anger him. They confused him. No one had ever looked at him like that. No one had ever shown him fearlessness in its purest form. And then came the fight. Foreman expected Ali to run. Instead, Ali leaned back on the ropes. He absorbed punches that would have ended the night for anyone else. Foreman hit him again and again, waiting for the moment Ali's legs would fold, waiting for the eyes to roll back. But every time Foreman stepped in to finish it, Ali spoke through clenched teeth. "That all you got, George." Those 5 words did something no punch could do. They made Foreman hesitate. As the rounds passed, the power that had crushed Frazier and Norton suddenly felt different. It no longer looked like destiny. It looked like a burden. Ali watched him slow down. Ali watched his confidence drain. And when the final moment came in the 8th round, Ali struck with a sudden combination that sent Foreman to the canvas for the first time in his life. But the true fear did not come from the knockout. It came afterward. Foreman described walking around the ring, searching for something he could not explain. He later admitted that he felt lost, empty, and frightened. Not of Ali the man, but of Ali the mystery. He could not understand how someone could absorb that kind of punishment and still stand tall. He could not understand how someone could remain calm in front of the most powerful puncher of the era. Years later, long after both men had retired, Foreman revealed the part he never said. He feared that if he fought Ali again, the same invisible force would defeat him a second time. He feared that Ali's intelligence, his timing, his mental strength, and his unnerving ability to control the rhythm of a fight would always neutralize raw power. That is why Muhammad Ali is number 1. Not because he hurt Foreman physically, but because he reached a place no other fighter ever reached. He made Foreman question himself. And in the heart of a heavyweight legend, that is the deepest fear of all. When we look at George Foreman today, smiling behind the microphone or preaching about second chances, it is easy to forget the storms he walked through. But his story is a reminder that greatness is not built on dominance alone. It is built on the moments when a champion confronts the truth about himself. These 5 fighters, each in their own way, forced Foreman to see the edges of his own strength. They showed him that even giants must face doubt. Even legends must feel the weight of uncertainty. Fear, for Foreman, was never an enemy. It was a teacher. It taught him humility after Ali. It taught him caution because of Shavers. It taught him survival the night he fought Lyle. It taught him respect for the aura of Sonny Liston. And it taught him patience in the shadow of Larry Holmes. These lessons followed him into his second career, when he returned to the ring as a 45-year-old man and shocked the world by becoming heavyweight champion again. In the end, Foreman's journey is not the story of a man who feared too much. It is the story of a man who learned from fear, used it, and rose above it. That is what makes him unforgettable. That is what makes him more than a puncher. Because behind every championship belt, behind every roar of the crowd, is a simple truth. Even the strongest need courage. And sometimes, courage begins with admitting what frightens you. If you want to explore more stories about boxing legends and the battles that shape them, stay with us.